going to be live. When you see me. Oh, okay, we're live.
All right.
We'll take your mask off.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to the final installment of the Hallie Ford School of Graduate Studies lecture series. At first here, I want to read a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land where PNCA is located rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tualatin, Calpooya, Malala, bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. We also acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many Indigenous Native American families today. As settlers and guests on these lands, we respect the work of Native nations, leaders, and families, and make ongoing efforts to center Indigenous knowledge, creativity, resilience, and resistance. We are committed to recognizing the ongoing relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and these places. Our region's Indigenous communities now include descendants of over 380 tribes, both local and distant. We at PNCA respectfully offer this acknowledgement as a small step on a path towards recognition and repair. And so, you know, I'm very excited to bring Nashin here, who I met in Jakarta in 2016, doing the, you know, just getting a short glimpse of the work that she has been doing ever since then and working so hard on. To introduce her, I'm gonna bring up one of our collaborative design MFA students, Brandy Hale. Just a short note about collaborative design. We really exist at the center of participatory engagement, system, you know, applied systems thinking and design with a capital D. And, you know, our students come from all these different backgrounds, and just the diversity and of interests is really exciting. So Brandy, if you want to introduce Nashin, and then we'll get going. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Do I have to adjust any of this or anything? Okay, great. Hi, Nashin. Great. So Nashin Mahtani is currently the director of Yayasan Peta Bencana, which in Indonesian is Disaster Map Foundation, a Southeast Asian-based nonprofit organization developing software infrastructures for community-led disaster co-management. She co-led the expansion of the life-saving platform PetaBencana.id from a real-time flood mapping platform serving 50 million people in Indonesia to a multi-hazard mapping platform serving over 350 million people in Southeast Asia. Supporting the development of one of the largest open source software projects for climate adaptation, her activism is dialectically driven by theory, scholarship, and anthropology. With a background in architecture, Nashin's applied and research investigations center around water policies and infrastructures, communication and media philosophies, and epigenetic adaptations. She is also principal co-investigator of MERA, a research and design collective investigating the future articulation of governance structures foregrounded in ecological homeostasis. In 2021, she was recognized by Forbes Asia 30 Under 30 for her contributions to the region's social issues. Nashin is also one of 5 global semifinalists for the prestigious Global Citizen Prize Cisco Youth Leadership Award in 2019, listed as a Southeast Asian women leader by Hallie in 2020, and recognized as a woman innovator by the Information Society Innovation Fund in 2018. Nashin's written, design, and film work has been widely published in numerous journals and exhibited across various international venues. She is a frequent speaker and presenter and continues to be engaged as a guest lecturer with schools and universities, including the Royal College of Art in London, McGill University in Montreal, University of Waterloo in Waterloo, Institut Teknologi Bandung in Bandung, and UNTAR, among others. Nashin previously worked as a designer and researcher with the Urban Risk Lab at MIT and has a research assistant at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture, where she contributed to projects focusing on flood risk mitigation. She completed her master's in architecture and bachelor's of architecture studies in the University of Waterloo, Canada. She has previously worked as an architect in New York, Los Angeles, Miami, and Toronto. So without further ado, we welcome Nashin Mahtani.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction and for the invitation to be here today, virtually to beam in with you. So today I wanted to share a little bit about the work that we're doing here in Southeast Asia, and how through a transdisciplinary method, we've been working on this humanitarian software that's now freely available for millions of people in the region, attempting to propel social and environmental justice. But as a point of departure, I want to always start from where we are. So during the past 2 years, the stark confrontation of living with uncertainty has sort of slammed every country with an undeniable immediacy. And even as vaccinations have quelled the spread of the virus in some geographies, we know there's still massive inequalities in vaccine distribution, and now the emergence of new variants continue to perpetuate this feeling of uncertainty. And certainly the latest performance of delegations at the COP26 summit leave much to feel uncertain about regarding the continuity of organized human society. But in the past months, types of responses to uncertainty have also been amplified. Often the loudest ones seem to manifest either as denial, as escapism, or as othering. But we know that living with uncertainty is not new. Everyone lives with degrees of uncertainty, and there are many people who live with higher degrees of risk and uncertainty on a daily level, and that actually perhaps offer a lot for us to learn from. And I would like to start this talk by sharing a story about what it means to live with uncertainty, and not in opposition to it, but really with it. And I would like to do this by bringing us to the slopes of Mount Merapi, which is one of Indonesia's most active volcanoes. So in our work, we had spent a lot of time along the slopes of Merapi in 2018, getting to know the communities who lived just a few kilometers away from the crater and who have a long history of living there. And there are several different villages that live on the slopes of this volcano, each with very distinct and unique traditions and customs and beliefs. But on the eastern slope, there's a village called Deles. And since 2010, when there was a really historic eruption, they started to strengthen their relationships with the monkey communities that live at the top of the volcano. So many other villages shoot the monkeys because the monkeys steal their crops. But in the village of Deles, they started to feed the monkeys fruit in order to sort of enter into an alliance with them, kind of as a risk reduction strategy. The reason for this is that the monkeys live closest to the top of the volcano, and so they're the earliest to respond in the event of an eruption. Right now at the base of Merapi, there is a monitoring center that has some of the most sophisticated technologies for estimating volcanic activity. But the monkeys are still some of the first to know that something is about to happen even before any of the seismographs can detect it. And so they run down the mountain away from the top. And because the village of Deles has welcomed them, they have no fear of passing through that village on the way down. So that's their escape route. And this in turn alerts the villagers. The villagers who live on Deles, after that, they started to develop a radio system by which when they see the signal of the monkeys running through their village, they use the radio to alert all of the other villages who live along the other sides of the slope. And in this way have developed this risk reduction strategy. And there are a few things I want to point out from this story that summarize a lot of what I'm going to share today, but also I think that are questions that we as designers need to think about. And so one is infrastructures of sense making. How do we make sense of the worlds we live in? How do we read the signals in our environments, interpret them so that we can cohabit our environments? The second is, what types of alliances do we form to extend those methods of sense making? And I think what's really important to point out from this story is what kind of alliances do we form, even with those who have different interests than our own? Because the monkeys steal, they can be considered a nuisance, but during a disaster, during an eruption, there is an alignment of concern. And so by alliance, they're actually mutual ways of living together. And then third is, how do we organize ourselves? Because one person feeding a monkey isn't going to develop that trust between the monkey and that pathway of evacuation. And so how do we organize ourselves collectively to adapt to highly uncertain environments and take action, starting with what we have, starting with the alliances that are available around us without resorting to techno-solutionist fantasies or fantasies of escapism. And I think these are all undeniably design questions tied to how we interpret, represent, and use these faculties of sense-making to live together. And so with that, I now bring us to Jakarta, which is where I'm from and where the work that I'm going to share emerged from. Jakarta is a mega city of 31 million people, and it's situated on the coastal edge of one of the world's most disaster-prone regions. Jakarta is actually built on a swampland, and so flooding has always been a part of this landscape that experiences a seasonal monsoon. But when it was colonized by the Dutch in the 17th century, they decided that they would turn this swamp into a port. What that meant is that the seasonal monsoon would disrupt commercial activities for a period of time. And so in order to prevent this, the Dutch invested in large-scale canal infrastructures to ensure that the water and the weather would not get in the way of economic activities. And so we see that the project of modernization is to control the weather, to relegate the water to where we imagine it should be, which of course completely transforms the relationship of water with the city. And this colonial legacy continues to permeate the city today. Jakarta is one of the most rapidly urbanizing cities in the world, and this places an incredible amount of pressure on these inherited colonial infrastructures. This incredibly high rate of urbanization, along with uncontrolled groundwater usage, is also causing land subsidence, where, as you can see in these images, which are images of the northern coast of the city is already 2 meters below sea level. So what you're seeing here is what separates the city from the sea is this foot-wide, very precarious concrete wall. And so instead of draining water down to the sea, we actually have to pump water up and over a seawall into the sea. And there are over 1,100 kilometers of canals, 400 pumps to manage the flow of water through this mega city. And so with this extensive infrastructural system in place to manage the flow of water, it means that if any of these components fail, if a pump fails, if the electricity to the pump is cut off, if a canal wall breaks, all of that water flushes back into the city. And that's exactly what's been happening in recent years. In a time of climate change, what we're experiencing is not a greater volume of water, but a greater intensity. And so more water is falling in less amount of time, and the infrastructures we have in place don't have the capacity to keep up with that changing intensity of the climate. And so all of the recent flood events that have happened in recent years have been a result of infrastructure failure. And this really requires us to think about forms of infrastructure and design that are far more flexible and adaptive. But if we look at the current flood mitigation projects currently in Jakarta, we see that the colonial ideology and relations still permeate the city's approach to water management. There are two main flood mitigation projects. The first is funded by the World Bank and the Japan International Cooperation Agency, and this is called the Normalization Project. Normalization means replacing the river's bank with concretized edges, which of course also means displacing all of the communities living along the river. We see a very sort of violent enactment of design in this project. But once again, the strategy in the 21st century is not very different from the 17th century, which is to define this hard edge and say that we'll put the river on the one side and the city on the other, and they never have to interact with each other. Of course, that's as much as we want to maintain this ideology of separation, we see throughout the years that the water will permeate the city. These infrastructures will continue to break. The other project, which I could talk at length about, but I won't, I'll just briefly introduce it, is called the Great Garuda. This was designed by the Dutch government and consultancy firms, and it's an infrastructural mega project involving the construction of a new 40-kilometer seawall to separate the sinking city from the ocean. It's estimated to cost $40 billion US, and the expense of this project will be partially recovered through real estate investment on newly built reclaimed lands that will be formed to create this image of Indonesia's national symbol, which is this mythical eagle known as the Garuda. So as you can see in these renderings, all of the image that's in white is the new proposed construction, the new reclaimed islands. All of those islands don't exist yet. And then the gleaming white real estate that will be on those to fund this project. Everything in black is the current city of Jakarta. So despite these fantastical images, in December 2019, when we were filming along the coast of Jakarta, we saw the collapse of the first 3% of construction of this new seawall, as you can see here. And so although the plan acknowledges that the most cost-effective strategy for flood risk mitigation is to reduce land subsidence, this Garuda project doesn't address that at all. And it insists that the design project is necessary by saying that the sinking of Jakarta cannot be stopped in time, and so we must build this wall. And we see here that urgency is invoked to posit this high investment offshore master plan as a standalone option, the only way forward, one that guarantees enormous profits for the Dutch water sector. And while construction continues, even in the same year, the president made a monumental announcement that because of increasing flooding and subsidence, Indonesia would move its capital city to the neighboring island of Kalimantan. Both these projects continue apace. But what I want to point out about this is that as designers, we are often tasked with and engaged in creating these future-oriented modes of representation. But these representations, whether they are realized or not, and the degree to which they're realized or not, have a very material impact because they facilitate the movement of material and the exchange of credit, and they're so often designed to enable the accumulation of capital elsewhere. And it really calls into question who is eligible, who has the agency to imagine, to measure or price the future, and by what means such positions of power are acquired and maintained. And one thing I want to highlight is how these projects are framed, which I think is really pertinent to research practices, to design practices as well, as how we frame context, because what these projects identify as problems are actually normal landscape processes. Flooding can be a threat to city, but it's also a vital link between rivers, floodplains, and deltas. But when the solution, like an engineering project, is what defines the problem, then the multidimensional risks of the monsoon are reduced to water entering the city. And other possible responses to the situation, or the readoption of strategies of living with the water, of living with uncertainty, are completely excluded. And so I think one of the fundamental questions to start with is how can we engage in challenging landscapes without presuming that there's going to be a one master solution that will solve everything. And I think this fundamentally comes from developing and working with a posture of humility and a broader definition of expertise eligible to attend to these challenges. And I borrowed this idea of eligibility from Abdulmalik Simon, whose work has had a profound influence on framing some of our thinking approach, but who is eligible to attend to these challenges? And we see that people living most closely with a particular set of challenges often have very useful ideas about how to deal with them because they've learned to read and pay attention to their environments very closely. So whether that is the behavior of the monkeys or for residents living along the rivers in Jakarta, they're able to predict the arrival of the force of the flood by noticing certain fluctuations, whether it's the pattern of the eddies or sometimes even they say the color of the water. But of course, projects like normalization have completely destroyed those type of resident knowledges because they've completely changed the way flooding happens in the city. And residents say the indices by which they learned to read the environment developed over generations have been completely disrupted by this engineering project. And so what can we do in this context? We speak a lot to the residents who are living in these environments, and we ourselves are living in them. And the sentiment expressed by many of them is unlike many that are expressed by major news outlets. When we see in the news, there's a lot of like sensational and apocalyptic and catastrophic narratives that Jakarta is sinking. And then there are these fantasies of escapism that we're going to move the capital and everything will be solved. But actually, if we look to the majority of people who are living in these conditions, the sentiment they express is that we live here, this is our home, these are the challenges we have to adapt to, and we just have to find new alliances, new ways of living with different types of uncertainty that are introduced. And to do this, they forge alliances and share in the work of co-producing viable lives among uncertain futures. And so another concept that I borrow also from Abdulmalik Simon and Edgar Pieters in this new publication on the bottom right of the screen called New Urban Worlds is they bring up this idea of makeshift, which is how the majority of people put together livable forms of inhabitation that are hardly institutionalized, but they form stabilities that come from constant efforts from the part of residents to constantly address the questions of where do we pay attention to and what forms of alliance can we take? And people adapt with agility and experimentation and paying attention to what they can do with what they have. And this has been fundamental to the approach that our work takes. And so although projects like normalization have completely destroyed the ability of residents to predict flooding, we see that digital media networks have provided new channels through which residents can share information in real time. And the ASEAN region is actually home to 100 million more smartphones than people. And Indonesia has some of the highest social media usage rates in the world. And as we can see in this image here, people are actively sharing information even when they're standing knee-high in floodwaters. It's quite a normal thing to take your first selfie in the flood, and it's a celebrated event. And even during the flood, Indonesians love sharing information on social media, and they're actively sharing information about points of access, about infrastructure updates, about community response. And so the question was, how do we make use of that distributed sense making that already exists in this media space and structure and represent it in a meaningful way to support coordinated and collective decision making during emergencies? And so in 2013, there was a team of researchers led by Etienne Turpin and Thomas Holderness, and they began to develop this open source software called Cognicity. And how it works is that it it is able to plug into any variety of social media and messaging apps and listen for specific keywords. So for example, in this post here, it detects that this user has used the word flood, which is something that's programmed to listen to. And when it detects this word, we have what we call humanitarian chatbots that send an automatic response to the user, introducing itself as, "Hi, I'm Disaster Bot," and then it asks the user if they want to submit a flood report, to reply. And if the user responds, they are guided through a few simple steps to submit a flood report, which includes confirming their location, adding a little bit of detail about the disaster, and they have the option to add photo and description. And as soon as they submit that, it's immediately plotted on a live web-based map, which is free and accessible for anyone to use. It's designed to be extremely data light and mobile centric so that it can be accessed on the most basic mobile phones, and especially during periods of peak activity during the disaster. And these are some examples of some of the observations that are shared. People are even sharing information during blackouts and they're sharing information about blocked roads, about broken infrastructure, and residents are using this to understand which areas to avoid, and to share information about their needs, as well as about community efforts for response. And this is a method of crowdsourcing that has allowed us to reach millions of users, allowing us to pull information from street level, from people who know the situation best, from those resident knowledges who are living with the disasters on an immediate and daily basis. At the same time, we also work with government agencies who are monitoring the map to attend to resident needs. And they say that it has significantly reduced loss because they're able to more immediately and more effectively allocate rescue and resource efforts to the places in need of it. And as a result, it's increased the speed of response. But critically, I think what's enabled us to do is it enables everyone to more equally participate in decision-making and resource management in their communities, especially during times of crisis. And we say that it has democratized decision support tools because instead of concentrating decision-making in a small handful of people, now every resident in the city is able to participate in this cooperative process. Everyone has that information in their mobile phones and can use that to support forms of collaborative coordination within their own communities, as well as across agencies. And as a result of this, we've not only seen greater coordination and trust forming, but over the years, new social relationships as well as a result of this transparent information sharing. And the reason that it works and that it continues to work is because of an ongoing and iterative process of design that really stems from collaborative co-research. We work with the widest variety of stakeholders and user groups, from government agencies to scientists to artists and philosophers and activists and students and first responders. And we work with them not as these one-off participatory workshops, but really as years of relationship building, where the parameters of the software design itself, the decisions behind how the interface looks, behind the design decisions behind all of the graphics directly stem from the conversations that we have with all of these different people. And we also take the infrastructure point of view, trying to understand the multidimensional angles of this ecosystem. And in this idea of collective infrastructure, collective equipment, and on ongoing maintenance, it's critical also for us to think about how do we incentivize the social production of this common infrastructure? Because it is, of course, it's a crowdsourcing platform. It's something that we collectively maintain, and we need collective participation as well. And so one of the key questions for us in continuing the project over such a long period of time is how do we design and people feel like it's theirs and they feel like they do want to contribute to it. On the right of the screen here, there are just a few theoretical texts that have been important to our work when thinking about the frameworks that we are operating within, especially like how do we design engagement when we know we operate within these very competitive realms of attention ecologies with so many different type of agencies trying to capture people's attention. We must consider how do we operate from within that infrastructure to redirect that attention towards more meaningful purposes. And these reflections inform the design of the platform and the socialization of it, even in seemingly subtle ways that have very profound implications. Such as the decision of where, whether we use videos or whether we use GIFs, or one of my favorite conversation topics within the team is these discussions about how does the bot speak? How does the bot address itself? And what type of language does it use? And the communication strategy is very intentionally about an element of humor or play that focuses not on the calamity of the disaster, but it's more of a lighthearted spirit and play on this Indonesian meme culture to focus more on what people can do together and to invite people, to encourage them to participate in this. And so if we return back to that question of eligibility, it's not only in designing the infrastructure to facilitate greater eligibility, but how do we then make people feel eligible to participate? That you don't have to be certified by any means to be able to participate in disaster management. Simply by being resident in a particular place, you are an expert of that place, and you don't need any other title to participate in infrastructure monitoring and in information sharing and in community coordination. And so in this way, through the design of the project and its implementation, it requires us to move between scales of bits and bytes and to understanding of the power structures that we are embedded within and how to work from within them. And to also understanding attention ecologies, to platform parameters, to social behavior. And it's actually really rewarding to be able to move between all of these scales in thinking about how to design the platform, how to design the engagement strategies. And I think it's only because we are able to move through all those scales that the software can act as infrastructure, because it is attentive to all of those elements. This is a data and operations diagram of the software, but I also, there's quite a lot of elements to it, difficult probably to grasp just through a slide. So there's a link to an animation there for anyone interested in the breakdown to it. But the reason I bring it up is that far beyond a technical description of data flows, this diagram, I think, also represents the partnerships that we must continually maintain that underpin the ability of the data to flow. So in order for the data to flow a certain way, for the information to come in a certain way, there are social relationships that underpin that. And that informs the majority of that work. And I really see that this is the design project, is to compose new relationships. What are the things that exist and how do we forge new relationships, new alliances between them? So one of the affordances also of software as infrastructure then is that it is far more flexible. It can scale in real time, unlike canal walls. And so during a flood, when we often experience a 26,000% increase in the number of people accessing our platform, our servers will clone themselves instantly and expand to allow for that increase, but then scale back down to one server in the same day once the traffic is down. So in the end, we don't need to spend large amounts of energy and cost on expensive servers that are sitting idly, but rather we can optimize this method of time sharing. And so software doesn't solve flooding, and it doesn't solve the disproportionate risks of climate change. But what it can do is to help gap the infrastructure failures. So when the hard infrastructures burst under that intensity of the climate, we have a space that can capture that overflow and then render it useful for people to navigate the city. And this suggests a different way of living with the water. And instead of insisting on the separation between the water and the city, that we cannot live with it, the platform reintroduces a relationship to the river that reveals the much larger spatial and temporal scales at play. And it opens up a space of a different way of understanding the water's flow through the city and of relating with the water. In this image here, where all of those blue dots represent reports that have been submitted about flooding, this is also an image of the river. And we see that data can, in this way, become tools for self-defense, for coordination, and the repatterning of civic management structures, which can be an alternate to the increasingly commercialized sector of the smart city that are rushing to monetize geospatial information. But that's why it's really important for us that this work remains open source. And it's really been fundamental to our work, this idea of a common infrastructure of collective maintenance, because when other people also use that software, we can learn from each other and benefit from that shared infrastructure. And this is precisely what has allowed the work to grow from what started as a research project in 2013 in one city in Jakarta to now a standalone NGO that was established in 2017, and which is now also expanded to a multi-hazard platform for the full country and expanding to the region as well. In addition to that, groups around the world, independent from us, have found the software and have started to adapt it to address their own needs, not limited to disasters, but also in some areas dealing with the management of food waste. And this is extremely enriching, because then we see that software can also act as a knowledge infrastructure. And so in this framework of thinking about design as a way and project of creating new relationships, new alliances, software itself becomes a very interesting design space where very different thinkers like anthropologists and IT architects and geospatial information engineers and designers and philosophers and artists can come together and work through this process of making in an iterative system that can be highly adaptive. And it's through an approach that rests on experimentation in order to open up different forms of knowledge production. And so I just want to summarize briefly by returning to Mount Merapi. And so since 2010, the Dallas Village has really strengthened their risk reduction strategies. And this has arisen completely from the ground up as a community initiative. And when we visited the Emergency Management Agency, who's located much farther from the volcano, we learned that they would now rely on news from the Dallas Village in order to alert the rest of the region. And this is actually really interesting because previous to the eruptions of 2006 and 2010, the Dallas Village said that they were among the last to know from the official information dissemination about any volcanic activity. And so they took it upon themselves to develop these risk reduction strategies that are multi-stable, multi-dimensional, and now those roles have changed. And now when we expanded the platform to facilitate information sharing about volcanic activity, we have incorporated those forms of tacit knowledge as something they can share widely. And so although it may seem odd to someone outside Indonesia that some of the symptoms people can report about are animal activity, actually this is really important to the communities living along the volcano. And so through months of study with them, we can calibrate these forms of tacit knowledge along with warnings from the observatory, and to try and open up these different forms of knowledge production as legitimate, as eligible, as trustworthy, and as essential to diversifying our modes of sense making. And so it's really not about abandoning the infrastructures that exist, but as designers, finding ways to reroute aspects of those to create less exploitive, more creative, and collaborative relations. And in a time now when we must adapt to really uncertain environments, adaptation is the act of repurposing and redesigning the things that already exist. And especially in the current context where we see so many different types of inequalities and challenges, and misinformation and polarization and power imbalances, as designers, I think it's our role to find ways to creatively position ourselves, because there are ways that we can work from inside of those systems in order to reroute them towards more collaborative ends. And so on that note, I will close and we can open it up to questions.
Thanks so, thanks so much, Nashin. Your work blows my mind, and it's so exciting to see how much, like Peta Bencana has scaled, and how, this idea of helping people thrive where they're at in this age of, mass refugee crises around the world is just, it's really exciting to think about what's possible. I'm going to open it up for anybody. If you have a question, come on up, and then just hit mute when you're done so Nashin can have good audio.
Hi, Nashin. Thank you so much. I'm really interested in this idea of harnessing multiple knowledges, specifically traditional ecological knowledge, like the knowledge of being able to observe the rivers or observe the animals in an area. How does your platform, without kind of a hierarchy and leadership, how does your platform organize that information and disseminate it, and kind of pull all the things together and kind of organize it?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So whenever all of the reports that are submitted to the platform are anonymous, and this was also something that was very important as we were designing it, and we were speaking to many of the people who live with disasters. Some disasters can be highly politicized, and so they weren't comfortable with sharing that information if it wasn't anonymous. And so anything submitted to the platform is completely anonymous. We don't store any of that information anywhere on, even in the database. And so people have developed a sense of trust that when they submit a report, no one can trace them through that. And so when they submit that report, everybody's report is rendered the same. It appears as a blue dot, or sorry, now that has changed. Now we have multiple hazards, so it appears as these icons on the map. And regardless if you're reporting as a resident, as somebody from the agency, and so everyone sort of is equal. Everyone is equally represented in the type of information they're sharing, but in the mechanism that we've designed to support that information sharing, we one of the slides I showed the steps to submit a report. That was a way for us to start to structure some of those crowdsourced information, because sometimes if there are not enough prompts, maybe there can be a lot of noise that comes in. And so by giving us a small sense of structure, that there are minimum requirements to submit that report. For example, for a flood, you have to input the flood height, and that's based on a graphic. So because people here speak about the flood based on bodily metrics, and so the graphic is there to facilitate that oh, it's ankle high or knee high, and there are these few key pieces of information that we found are critical to understand the severity of the disaster. So for flood, it was the flood height. For haze, for example, it was respiratory symptoms. And so there's a few key pieces of information that people are required to submit, and then a few that are optional, like the photo and the description, where they can add free text. And so that gives enough of a structure, but also enough of a free space to add anything additional. And people add a variety of things, whether it's about why the infrastructure broke, or why the blackout occurred, or if they need certain resources. But then, yeah, it's equally represented on the map, and that's how it's organized. And while we do work with the government agency, they're able to see all of those reports coming in as equal. There's no differentiated weight among the reports that are coming in from residents.
Thank you so much. Do we have other questions in the audience? Okay, we've got somebody else coming up.
Hi, Nashin. Thank you so much. I'm really interested in scalability of this project. I guess specifically about the project, there are so many other cities around the globe that have similar issues that Jakarta does with being below sea level and dealing with floods. And I think we'll see more cities deal with that probably in the future. So I'm interested in scalability, I think maybe specifically with this project, but also I think like how you think about scalability as a designer, just in general.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And something that we're definitely like right always in the middle of, I think, how do we think about scale without while recognizing that this arose from a very specific condition, and like we deal with multiple scales, right? So how do we allow that scalability without losing those tacit knowledges? And I think what's been fundamental to allowing this project to scale so quickly is the fact that it is an open source software. And so even though, and a very collaborative approach as well. And so even though the core team in the NGO is small, we've worked with many different experts and many different types of people along the years who either come in for a short period of time, or even like when we work in Indonesia, we work together a lot with universities and researchers and students. And so it's not developing this project in isolation, but developing the relationships with people we know are experts. So for example, like when we expanded in 2000, we started the research to expand to other disasters in 2016. And in that process, we started to partner with universities across Indonesia who had specific expertise in that particular disaster. So for example, in Mount Merapi, there's a university located in the nearby city who of course has a very extensive volcanology department. And so working with them, knowing that they have much higher degree of expertise in the area and that they would also have networks with much higher degree of expertise, that way we sort of compound that knowledge at a much quicker scale, and then are able to build up our own understanding of what needs to be done to design the platform. But by making it open source, that way, like all of this work is accessible for anyone to see. And as a result of that, it's like groups, and for example, in 2017, a group in Vietnam saw the software completely independent from us. They adapted it to build their own flood mapping platform. But when they did that, they were able to add features that we hadn't figured out yet. And when they contacted us, they were having difficulty with implementing the project, mainly like forming these types of alliances on the ground level. And they contacted us to learn how we were able to manage that here. But when they did that, we also found out that they were able to introduce some technical aspects that we hadn't figured out. And so there was this incredibly rich knowledge exchange. And this is the benefit of open source, is that by making it open, we can accelerate the things we're able to do by being able to build off of each other. And that's what we did. And then in Hong Kong, there's project called Breadline that's now using the software for food waste distribution. And so they're able to actually, if we step back a little bit, they're able to use the software to address this challenge of logistics and like resource distribution in a non-emergency context. And so now by working with them, we're trying to see that if we consider that an experimental scenario for a crisis context, how can we learn from that in order to do that here? And so in this way, we didn't have to start from scratch. We don't always have to start from scratch. There are already things that are working and that we can adopt. And I think this is perhaps a useful way to think about scale without imposing something alien on other geographies, but like when we scale to other geographies, actually, how do we learn from what's already there? How do we learn from the shareable things in our software, but then learn from the tacit knowledges in those locations, and then find ways to where they can mix, and then that sort of allows us to learn at a much faster scale.
Thank you, Nashin. Other questions?
I totally have so many more. But I love talking to you all the time. You gently talked about the Great Garuda project and how it's just starting and falling into the ocean. And these kind of thinking about this balance of for the government or funding agencies of how do we think about these big kind of, one would say colonial, especially since it's the Dutch, technocratic solutions of like building new islands in the sea for people, with sea level rise versus, these kind of decentralized community empowered projects that you're working on. How, can you just speak to the scene of the juicy scene, maybe of funding and how you you're making an amazing film that you weren't able to show us there, but that's now at the Hong Kong Museum. Can you just speak to how you're getting the message out into the world and who's funding these projects? And do you feel empowered and inspired that will continue, or do you see the kind of technocratic aspects creeping in?
Yeah, thank you, Sky. Well, I think as designers, we must be optimistic if our task is to imagine worlds. So I think I despite, of course, there are all these power imbalances, all these technocratic solutions that it breaks our heart every time we go and film or we go and visit and we see that this project is continuing even with all its failures. But then, it's about, I guess, thinking of what can we do. And in terms of funding, our project we're now an independent NGO. And so our project has been funded by international grants, currently by USAID, but also it was a very deliberate decision to become an NGO, because that institutionalization of the project allows us to forge different types of alliances that we weren't able to do as a research project. And so I think this also goes back to the question of scaling, is that thinking about the form of the institution you will take or you will incorporate is also important in thinking about how the project will scale. And so becoming an NGO was a deliberate decision on that part to allow us to create these relationships both with universities, but then also this year we're really hoping to expand our support from Indonesian-based businesses and NGOs, Indonesian-based businesses who could benefit from this data. And so while we always think that it's really essential that this information remains free and open source, but there are certain local actors who would benefit from it as well, that we see can play a really big role in contributing to allowing this information to remain open for the public and remain free as a free service for the public. I think definitely funding is always a challenge, at least maybe in the early stages of being an NGO, but it's not without its own navigations. But I think by making these decisions to be an NGO, we have access to certain ways of funding that we might not have typically. And I think it's our role also as designers, how do we market this? How do we pitch it to different groups in order to get those streams in and in order to allow us to continue this type of work at this scale.
Thank you so much. Are there any other questions? Your minds are blown. Thank you so much, Nashin. It was such a pleasure having you, and good morning to you over there in Indonesia. Yeah, do we have any questions on YouTube?
Yes, sorry, we just got one.
Oh, we have one more question on the live YouTube channel.
I'll come read it. That's easiest.
Hi, I'm back. This this question is from Herman de Hooge. Can you talk more about how the disaster community coordination platform integrates with those used by formal disaster aid and recovery organizations such as Red Cross or NGOs?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it also ties back to the question of scale. It seems like a lot does. But yeah, so, well, first initially we started to work with the government emergency management agencies, so the official national and city level disaster management agencies who are now monitoring the map in real time to understand to resident needs. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier is all of this data is open. And so it already feeds into a variety of applications, including the Pacific Disaster Center, some of the applications of the World Bank itself. And just actually in 2019, we started working with Indonesian Red Cross, who have started to use the data. It automatically feeds into their management platforms. And so especially as we scale the project this year, we're really focusing our efforts on scaling those partnerships with agencies across the country. We are working with NGOs both at a national and local level who are ingesting this data either through an open API, so that data is automatically integrated in real time into their own platforms if they have it, or they are monitoring it, whether for those agencies that have the luxury of control rooms, some are monitoring it through their mobile phones to then allocate their resource teams. And then this year we will also be working, I think one of the things as we expand more and more is to understand that these projects are also tied to questions about data literacy, and not everybody knows how about data privacy and security measures and pulling from the API. So this is part now of our socialization and engagement strategy, is to facilitate that type of knowledge distribution so that more groups, more than PMI, but like local volunteer and response teams have that at least base knowledge they need to draw the data from our platform in any way that's useful to them. And so that's part of our upcoming activities for this year, as we just actually launched to the national scale last year. So we're still very much in the early stages of engagement and socialization and all of these types of data integration with the many different stakeholders who are responding at different levels.
Thanks, Nashin. I have a question that's sort of the opposite of the institutional response. Because this is open source and collaborative, have you seen a lot of sort of emergent community-based response, like mutual aid, or like, especially in areas that are maybe more remote and outside of the city? Have you seen kind of like neighbor helping neighbor, or neighboring city helping neighboring city emerge using this platform, as well as institutional response like Red Cross and things like that?
Yeah, thank you for such an important question. So I think actually the platform extends a spirit that's already there. So in Indonesia, we have this term called gotong royong, which means mutual aid. And there's already, like, it's in the culture. There's such a rich spirit of mutual aid, of helping each other. And like during disasters, you will see that there is no shortage of people coming to help each other. That's already part of, it's just part of what people do. And so I would say that the part of the reason also the platform is successful is that it extends that spirit. It scales it up. It what people are able to do within their own communities. Now, by sharing that knowledge, they can expand their forms of coordination to a larger scale. And so now we see that the forms of mutual aid are able to expand to greater scale, where like sometimes it's, yes, cities helping a community from a certain city helping someone else, or neighborhoods across the city, they are helping each other. But yeah, I think I don't think the platform created that. I think it extended that capacity, and I think that's a capacity that exists. And so we, in this case, like technology is used to scale something that's already there by organizing it and by making it widely available. And then as a result, creating extended relationships.
All right, I thank you so much. Yeah, I think a trip to Indonesia is in order for all of us. Thank you so much for your time and your incredible presentation. Thanks to all who joined virtually. And thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Thanks, Guy. Take care.
Thank you.